My name's Noel. I'm a psychotherapist. I'm your host for this evening. Really, really lovely to have you back with us. We've got a fantastic guest on the show tonight. Jacqui Lane has joined us. And we were having a great conversation just before we went live, which I'm going to bring you into, and hopefully you'll join us in the conversation as well. This is the eve of lockdown 2.0 in the UK, so I'm sure we'll cover that and what sort of we feel about that. Just to remind you, as it's a live show, we stream on multiple platforms. And if you're watching on one of those platforms on YouTube or Facebook or on Periscope, it'd be great to get your comments and thoughts. So pop them into all the various chat boxes that exist. My team will pick them up, or you can send them to us directly on my phone, this thing here. And the number is 07506 319 745. That's +44 7506 319 745. That number goes out every week, and my team will just pop it into the chat boxes as well. So you can give us a call. If you're calling from outside the UK, you do it on WhatsApp. Save yourself the money. And it'd be great to hear from you and join us. Hello, Jacqui.
Hello.
Good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How are you doing?
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. Yeah, life here in Blackpool. Our illuminations get shut off tonight, so we go into darkness. Yeah, just to
one of the things that happens as a result of the new.
Yeah, just I guess manage the people coming into Blackpool. But we're hoping to be back on in December and run through to New Year, which is an extension to what we normally do. But other than that, we're doing good. Yeah, we're doing good.
So you're a psychotherapist and also a life coach.
Well, more coaching. So no, I didn't qualify as a psychotherapist, a counsellor, studied psychology at degree level, and then coaching, did 3 years of coaching diploma and trainers and some NLP and some behavioural profiling stuff. Yeah, so a bit of
it's really, really, really good to have us have you on the show. How are you finding the whole sort of pandemic thing? Because you've been in the UK for the whole of the pandemic now, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Well-travelled person, which I'm sure we'll get into. But how are you finding it all?
From a work point of view, switched to online with private clients, with clients in services. A lot of the services I worked with have changed or closed. But as we were talking about a little bit earlier, the services that are residential that I go into, it's managed very well. And there's plenty of we work in huge, great big rooms with plenty of room to distance and ventilation. So far it's been okay. Yeah.
You're working with young people in residential care at the moment?
Young people, yeah. Two sites with the local arm of our social housing local arm, Blackpool Coastal Housing. So 2 sites, residential supported accommodation for young people.
Young people, what, 16, 17?
Yeah, 16 and 17-year-olds in one, and 18 to 24 in the other, and that starts tomorrow. So exciting.
24, so what social services used to call the leaving care team?
Yes. Well, I think they're a bit of a mixture. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. I haven't started yet, but I think it's a mixture. But yes, there certainly will be care leavers in there. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's quite a challenging work, sort of working with young people in that setting, because of course they're in residential care for various complex and challenging reasons. Which we may go into. It'd be interesting to get some of your background, I think, because you have an interesting personal history, a personal story, which we talked about.
Colourful.
I mean, I think it's interesting, insightful, and instructive, and may give some identification for people. And so sort of had quite a journey in your life so far.
Yeah, it has been. So I began dancing, of all things. Trained in ballet and danced and what have you. Wasn't particularly dedicated, loved dancing, and I think I was pretty good way back then, but lacked the dedication, so it was a bit hit and miss. But we moved to Blackpool. My parents, my dad, my stepdad, his circus family.
Yeah.
So sort of circus background, and but of course the hire and supply of the big top was their thing. The circus had long since finished. And we had an 8-week season in Morecambe with the big top, and met a man who had a hotel in Blackpool. And I think they both had enough of canvas and wet days and what have you. So we came to Blackpool and moved into this hotel, and we settled here. And that was, gosh, 30 years ago now. And it was in that time I met and fell in love with, at the tender age of 24. A local guy. He's actually from Glasgow, Joe, and he was a heroin addict. I didn't know. Drugs had never been my background, and never anything that I'd gotten involved with as a youngster. So completely green. And over time, and he sort of prolonged this courtship. It didn't go anywhere or for a long time, and I thought that was strange. And the next thing I know, he's decided to take himself off to Spain for a week. Unbeknown to me, he'd taken himself off to Spain to sort of do this cold turkey that would sort him out, and he could come back and proclaim his undying love, and we would live happily ever after. And of course, it was an absolute...
That didn't work out that way somehow.
No. No, it didn't work out at all. No. Anyway,
it's a classic sort of addict thing to do, though, isn't it? Right, I've fallen in love. I want to get married to her. I better just go and sort out my heroin addiction. I know what I'll do. I'll go and take a week in Spain, just not use, come back, and it'll all be sorted. Okay.
How's that working out for you, in the wonderful words of Dr. Phil? Yeah, and of course I had no idea. In fact, I was a bit perplexed why he would decide to clear off to Spain for a week with his friend, but there we go. Anyway, the relationship progressed, and I still had no idea, and then started to notice subtle changes in him. Never ever in my wildest dreams did I think it was heroin addiction. That was something on Train Spotting that was my generation at the time, and about as far removed from me as Australia, which obviously came very close to me, as did drug addiction. So I started to notice these really subtle changes, and I thought, is he drinking special brew? Is he going out and drinking? You know, he was only out for short bursts, but came back different. I thought, the only thing that can do that to somebody, in my mindset, was special brew, Carlsberg special brew. And then over time, I got more curious. People started to subtly let me know it was something more serious and sinister. If you get a special brew.
Well, those special brews quite serious and possibly quite sinister at times as well. Yes.
And of course, I never knew what he did for a living. I knew he had always had a few quid about him, but I didn't know what he did. And of course, he sold heroin, and that's where he would go off to. He had this white van, and he was known around the town as the ice cream man. I didn't know that though. And then eventually there was a one night, and it all came tumbling out. He couldn't hold it in any longer, and I was beginning to know more and more.
So I guess as a heroin addict, you didn't have horns growing out of his head or a tail. There wasn't obvious telltale signs like that.
Not to me. I'm sure there were to others, but not to me. I mean,
as a heroin addict, but also as a dealer, one would surely expect that somehow there was a brand on his
True. Yes.
Yes.
No, in fact, he was a very lovable, very likable, gypsy kind of look to him, rogue.
Sure.
Yeah, everybody enjoyed his company. He had lots and lots of friends, not all in the same boat as him.
Friends. He wasn't like the LA gangster with sort of tattoos and all that sort of stuff.
No.
Want to settle down and all that sort of stuff. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. It certainly, there was nothing about him that suggested to me he was some sort of you know, stereotypical addict train spotting movie kind of thing.
Well,
no,
in some ways he was the stereotype, and that's not the stereotype. I mean, the
that's
stereotype
right. Yes,
is,
indeed. Yes.
the stereotype is that you can easily spot these people, and
Yes.
they are these people. They have certain types of characteristics. Nobody's ever really been able to tell me exactly what those characteristics are, but they have them.
Yeah.
And you should be able to see them. But I mean, you're sort of living proof of somebody who, you know, just had a nice person in your life who
and he was kind, he was loving, he was generous, he was funny, he was great company. I think it was my sister that commented on the two of us that we were kind of buddies that hung out together. It was lovely, and no, there was absolutely nothing that suggested to me there was anything untoward going on that like that. No.
I'm listening. I'm just responding to a message. They come through.
Right.
So we're getting messages through. So I'm listening, but my apologies for
Yep.
getting distracted. So how long did the relationship go on for?
Well, I think it went on for 5 years. We were about 8 months in when I discovered the truth. And it was a desperate evening, really, where Joe just couldn't hold it anymore. As I say, I was beginning to get more and more aware that something wasn't quite right. And when he told me, all I felt, I didn't feel scared at all. All I felt in that moment was absolute relief, just this huge wave of relief that I wasn't going mad. There was something more that I had sort of felt, perceived. And this sort of wave of relief, it was like, oh, well, God, now we know the problem. We just go to the doctors, because nobody wants to be a heroin addict. Nobody chooses to be a heroin addict. All that's happened is he's not been able to go to the doctors or get some help. You just get some help, because once you get the help, you go, thank you, I needed some help because I didn't want to be a heroin addict, and you get well.
Yeah. And how did that work out? Can you remind me how that story works?
Well, if I tell you, as I'm sure.
So I'm just doing the math at the moment. You're 8 months into a 5-year relationship. I think I know how it worked out. So he tells you 8 months in, I'm an addict. 5 years later, is he still an addict? 5 years?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
5 years later, he's still an addict. I've had 1 or 2 brushes with the law. I've got stuff on my own record. I've dabbled myself. I'm on my knees and I crawled out of the relationship. And he was in exactly the same position as he was when we first met.
Which is, you know, a very familiar story, that the cost of the addiction will hit the addict, but more often it hits the family and the loved ones around as much, if not more.
Yeah. I remember as a girl, I think I was 10 or 11 years old when Elvis Presley died. And I was as a young girl, huge Elvis Presley fan. And when he died, I remember I read everything avidly, and there was a bit from Priscilla Presley in a newspaper, and the line read something like, Elvis's addiction to drugs almost cost me my life. And I didn't understand that as a 10, 11-year-old girl. How can somebody else's addiction affect you? And of course, 14, 15 years later, I discovered exactly.
How did it affect you? All joking aside, I mean, you said you got out of the relationship. I can imagine, but you know, what happened during that period of time?
Oh gosh, all and everything in between. I became Miss Marple. I snooped. I didn't trust. I became obsessed with tinfoil going missing in the house. I became obsessed with where he was, how long he was, and my whole focus at times was most of the time was all about where he was, what he was doing. And I got pretty clever at deciphering just from the look in his face. So it's sort of subtle muscle loosening in his jaws, to his eyes, to all sorts, and I could usually pinpoint how much he'd had and what he'd used on top of that to disguise what he'd had. And it just became an obsession, an absolute obsession. And my own life sort of plummeted. I didn't really, I still worked, but not, they were just kind of, I worked as a hotel receptionist, and I worked in bars, at pubs and bars and things behind the bar. Nothing of any substance. I completely lost my way, and he became he was an obsession.
Almost like your own little addiction.
Yes, yeah. And then I never touched heroin, but I did. We went through all kinds of different paths. He went on methadone. He went into rehab. He arrived home 48 hours later saying they kicked him out. They hadn't. He'd left. And of course, I mean, some of the stories are hilarious of the lies and what he would do to cover up. But we went through the whole gambit of stuff. And sorry, what was the question, Noel?
He became your little addiction. It was really, the question was about what was the journey?
Yeah. So
where did you end up, as it were?
Yeah. So I ended up very much seeing the underbelly of this town. I ended up in those very rooms that were in Train Spotting. I ended up in the more darker sides of Blackpool. And I knew people.
And what were you doing? Sort of accompanying him, sourcing your own drugs, or what was?
No. I just by almost. I was certainly not I didn't intentionally go out with him, but you know, we'd be out or driving home. I've just got to pop in somewhere, or he'd see somebody and he would just swerve. They either owed him money or something, and I would. It was just by bit. It was like when he needed to do something, it was like if I was with him, well, I just had to kind of be involved. So he kept me out of it. In fact, that was another issue. It felt like it was worse than somebody having an affair, because his world was extremely secretive. Everybody around us, all of our mutual friends knew, and many of them were involved in that world, and not me. So I felt very excluded at some times, but then at other times, just by virtue of the fact of an opportunity for him, I ended up in some pretty grim flats and houses and sorts of
really awful things, quite traumatic things, actually, because stuff. And you said you had some brushes with the law and things like that.
Yes. He got a bust, and not at our home. He didn't keep the drugs that he sold at our home. He kept them somewhere else, and they bust him. They knew him. He was fairly notorious at that time. And then they came and got me, and took me to the cells as well. And that was really difficult, because I hated what he did, and I spent all of my energy and time obsessing and trying to stop what he did to get him into some kind of recovery. But when he got bust, being in the cells, if I knew what he was doing, then I would have been an accomplice in some way. So I had to hold my hands up to something. Otherwise, I would have looked completely stupid. They just wouldn't have bought it, and they might have come down even heavier on me. So I had to own up to using cannabis, to knowing that Joe used cannabis and smoked cannabis and cannabis in the house, and I had to own up to that. He never kept, other than personal use, heroin in the house. There was never any, as far as I know, lumps of heroin hanging around, or if they were, it were briefly, but there was cannabis in the house.
And why did you hang around for so long? Do you know?
Good question, Noel. Good
Time
question.
to hang around. I mean, I think I know what the answer is. I'm just trying to put questions to you that might be going through other people's heads.
Yeah. Do you know, I'm not even sure what the answer is. Let me take myself back there.
Yeah.
I think, again, I'm going back to when I was 24, 25, although I did make similar mistakes again a decade or so later. So maybe it's me. But I did there was something about Joe that I loved, and I still do. He's not with us now. He passed away long after we broke up, but we were in the periphery of each other's lives. We kind of checked in with each other once or twice a year after that. But I adored him in so many ways. There was something very lovable about him, and there was something clever about him. He was very interested in antiques. He was so funny, and he could never stop using heroin for us, for himself, for a future. But aside from that, there was nothing he wouldn't have done for me, and at times really did pull out all the stops for me when I had gone through some of my own just sort of life stuff. And he was paradoxically always there for me. I was on a pedestal with him. There was never any, other than what comes with addiction, there was never anything other than love and kindness in the relationship, as odd as that sounds.
That doesn't sound odd at all. I mean, it explains it. I mean, it sort of puts flesh on those bones, doesn't it, people listening?
And I wanted, we had, when heroin wasn't the obsession or in the middle of it, we had some amazing times. We did lots of stuff together, and I wanted him to be well. I really wanted him to be well. There was just too much about him that was being lost to heroin addiction, and that saddened me greatly. And of course, there is the own sort of psychological stuff where you get so far in that to give up means you've just wasted a year, and then you've wasted 2 years. Well, if I just try for another year or 6 months, then
obsessive addiction, if I do this, it will change.
It will change,
and all of that stuff. And then 5 years later, it doesn't. You're in a state where you leave. Was there a precipitation to that? Was there a reason, or was it just?
Yes, there was. He got sent to prison, and he was in for several weeks, and he did stop using in prison. And I remember going to see him in Haverick, and he looked fabulous. He had put on weight, his skin colour was there, his eyes, he had these amazing shiny eyes. He really was a kind of David Essex kind of look to him. Well, in my eyes anyway. And he looked fabulous when I went to see him in Haverick. And we had tried everything, exhausted. I had exhausted every opportunity known to sort of any form of recovery. I didn't know what else to try. And the last thing was, if you get clean in prison, great. If you don't, I knew this was my last. I just couldn't do it anymore. And of course, whilst he was in prison, I had got used to some time by myself, and recovered a little bit of myself, and the obsession began to sink, because he wasn't there. He was away, and so I rediscovered my own mind and self. And so when he came out, going back into that was almost just unworkable. I couldn't have done it that another time. I'd had too much time by then to get used to not living with addiction. So he came out, and I think he lasted 2 weeks. And by that time, crack had hit Blackpool. Well, it hit Blackpool before that. He had been involved with it, but then he had become quite involved himself with it. So by this time, within 2 weeks, he then had a crack and a heroin habit. And I had to go. I knew if I didn't leave then. I had dabbled in crack. I didn't know it was crack. I didn't know what crack was in the first instance. He told me it was cocaine, and they give you it in this rock. Just a different way of using cocaine. I hadn't really used, as I said, drugs wasn't a thing for me. But a little bit of a party drug here and there, and and there was a part of me thought, well, maybe we can, sort of connect if we both have a line of coke or a rock of coke. And it was sometime later I discovered exactly what he had given me, and I knew, and I liked crack Noel, I did, and because I had
haven't
witnessed.
met anybody who said they didn't like it, to be honest.
No, well, there you are. Yeah. And having been witness to the devastation and destruction of 5 years of his addiction, I knew that if I stayed with him, he wouldn't stop bringing it home, and I had to go. Yeah. So those two reasons, really. Those two reasons.
Very sensible. And so, what was your next step? What was the next phase of
my
your...
next step? Well, I needed to work it out. I knew that Joe and I loved him, and I knew he loved me in as far as he could. And I needed to figure this out. My mum once said of me, my daughter, as a teenager, my daughter doesn't talk to people, she interviews them. So I've had this interest in people, and I could not work out the phenomenon that was addiction. I knew he didn't want to do this. But he couldn't stop, and I needed to figure it out. So I went back to uni, and studied psychology, and I wanted to understand stuff about the mind. What is it? I wanted to understand that. And there was a point when I was with Joe. It was a particularly dark time, and I'm not religious, but I prayed, and I knew when I prayed one night, there is a reason I'm with you. I don't know what it is, but I think in time it will show itself. There's a reason why I'm with you. And of course, the reason for me, although my mum might disagree, was he completely changed the course of my life. I got some substance on the bones for me. I got some qualifications. Rather than just sort of gypsying around the country, as my sister would say, or around the world, or festivals, or this or that, doing, whatever.
Yeah.
I got real, really, and I decided to get some. And I worked while I was studying in children's homes and supported accommodation and other places, and in pubs and bars and things, and got myself through a degree. And then and then my counselling diploma as well, I started that, and towards about halfway through, they advertised for a trainee counsellor at a rehab down the road from me, and I was working at probation at the time, as an admin. Yeah.
You knew probation quite well, I'm sure, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I'd be there typing away in probation.
Your mates.
Joe would arrive at the window.
Know this person, they're a friend of Joe, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, exactly. You'd have been a valuable resource in probation. I'm just thinking about that thing of you knew he was there for a purpose, or you knew these experiences. Which I think is something to sort of sit and ponder and reflect about, because I think that sense of being able to make meaning from challenge is a really, really important skill. And I guess you understand what I'm talking about now, because as a professional, you understand. And it's part of what's called positive psychology and those types of approaches to life, which I guess you didn't have that framing at the time. You just were reaching for something bigger than the shit I'm in.
Yes.
And when we do that, real possibilities emerge in terms of personal growth and embracing change and developing what's called a growth mindset, which I'm sort of quite, I think it's quite important at the moment, given the pandemic and everything that people are going through, because most sort of models of therapy, modern therapy, are based on the notion of building resilience, which is a good idea. But resilience is being challenged at the moment because of the pandemic, and because we're all in this together, and all our resources are becoming gradually diminished. And so we can flip it, I think, into these sort of positive psychology models. And you've just given a brilliant example of it. You don't really need to understand this stuff as long as you do it.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? You just, as long as you do that thing of like, no, this must mean something. This horrible thing I'm going through must mean something. That's all you have to do. Decide to believe that, and things can transform quite a lot in your life.
Yes.
I just wanted to sort of come back, and because I thought it's a very important thing. So you train as a professional, and you're doing it in your usual sort of magician way. You're sort of presenting these things like, watch this hand, and there's really something going on over here, isn't there? So I'm sure you're very good as a counsellor in that sense, and
Thank you.
your patients don't understand what's happened till they're slapped by the wet fish.
I've said that.
Oh, I wasn't expecting that. What was that, a salmon? Thanks. So yeah, I can see your style and how it works. Very disarming, but I'm in the same trade, so don't try it on.
No, I was already disarmed. But I came on.
And you did, I guess, what you know, a number of people do in response to being confronted by somebody else's addiction, which is go and learn about it and train in the field, and move into the field. And you said you started working in some rehabs. In this context, inpatient residential settings, correct?
Yes. Yep.
For the treatment of addiction and associated disorders, I imagine. But primarily, I guess, it would have been the sort of Minnesota model at that time.
Well, now there's a question. So it was 12-step, and I'm not sure. My boss in rehab was in recovery himself, and he was quite an astonishing man, particularly when he was on form. He was just astonishing to watch him work, and he had kind of his own model, and I think he had desperately tried to get clean. He was an Australian, desperately tried to get clean in so many rehabs, multiple times in Australia, and failed miserably. And he put it down to the way that he knew what would work for him, and he said he got clean in spite of rehabs and models. And so he kind of developed his own emotional recovery model of treatment. Now, we were the secondary unit. Mark and I worked in the secondary unit, so they had already gone into Pierpoint, which was quite confrontational, into the primary unit. It was quite confrontational, sort of family dynamics, family damage, very much about containment, quite harsh, I think, at times. So by the time they would come down to us, they would the peers would be in primary for about 3 months. And by the time they would come down to us, they were certainly detoxed and clean, not sort of just walking through the door, sort of using one day and in rehab the next. They'd been clean for a while. And somebody once described it that primary was about what you've done to others, and secondary was about what has happened to you, to have created that. So we were all about emotional recovery. And, you know, I began as a trainee, I left as the senior, but in terms of qualifications, all I had was psych and counselling. I didn't have anything more than that. Mark had some qualifications. I'm not sure what they were, his model of working, but I think we weren't the most qualified of people, but what we managed to create in that rehab, and it chokes me sometimes when I think about it, was an extraordinary place of warmth and safety and security. It was an extraordinary therapeutic environment, and when, for the majority, I mean, obviously we lost peers along the way, those that left or needed to leave, but for the most part, we had a great success, and we just had this extraordinary house. It was a magical house, and just the usual kind of stuff, group work. We did lots of days out as well. We went camping. We made Christmas a big deal. We built in lots of fun as well, because you can't go to some of the depths that the peers went to in there, and they did go to some incredible depths. It was a privilege, Noel, to witness and to work with, and to have people's lives placed in our care for safekeeping whilst they unravelled the trauma and the damage, and the whole environment supported that. So it was a privilege. And I remember There was one gentleman came through in his mid-30s. He was married with children, and he was an extremely polite, well-mannered, well-presented young man, but very shut down emotionally. And we weren't in the business in Holly Lodge of pushing people into any kind of disclosures, taking group time, anything like that. We just trusted the process, and the therapeutic environment would facilitate that at some point. We knew a little about his background, and we knew it was very dark. It was along the lines of A Boy Called It. I'm sure you know of the book. It was some real...
It's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. It's leave you with nightmares. Horrific.
Yes, and that was akin to his upbringing, and no wonder he didn't want to go there. And I was taking a group one day, and somebody else was taking group time. My focus was on them, and I noticed, I just felt there was something going on in the group. And when I had to look away from who was sharing at the time, this man started to just crumble, and he started to ooze fluid. I've never seen anything like it since, and I had never seen anything like it before. He started to ooze fluid from everywhere, every orifice within him, and he started to make primal noises, just primal, not screams, but just primal noises. And I was out of my depth. I was scared, anxious. I no idea what I didn't know what to do with this. And I thought, well, you're the only one in the room, the only sort of counsellor in the room. You can't bail. You've got to do something. So I just gestured to everybody else in the group to leave the room, which they did gladly. And I didn't know what to do, so I just did what I felt to do. And I went and sat next to him, and I put my arms on his shoulders, put a hand on each shoulder. And as I did, I felt the weight of him sink, and it was almost as if somebody's got me now. I can let this go. And he absolutely oozed fluid. He reeked this stuff, this fluid coming from him, absolutely stunk. And it was a most powerful experience for me. And he continued to make noises. I can't remember if I spoke or not. I just held him and I stayed with him. And I can't remember how long it lasted for. But when he was through that, we gathered him up, the house rallied round him, we ran baths for him, and nobody spoke about what had happened because there were no words. This was just like a physical experience. Eventually I left and I went back into work the next morning. As I walked through the doors, he was coming down the stairs, and he looked like he had been reborn. It was just this completely, and I've never forgotten it. And I learned in that moment that, one, you don't need to be an expert particularly. You just need we need to know stuff, but you just need to be, when someone is that in that kind of a state, you just need to be with them, and stay with them. And the second thing I learned was, no matter how deep or dark you go, your stuff won't kill you. You will come out of the other side. And so I learned to trust that when you kind of sense that someone wants to go somewhere, and you know they do, but they're just a bit afraid, but it's what they want, then don't be afraid to take them as far as you can, because on the other side of it, they'll shine again. So it was a very powerful experience, and one I'd never forgotten. But there were a few in there. There were a few really privileged moments.
And I mean, it's interesting, I think, because I think that there is a lot of, if people don't experience trauma going into the addictive stuff, they certainly pick up on trauma during it. And there are some strong theories now that suggest that trauma may be at the core of addiction. I'm ambivalent about that. I mean, I think it's more inherited stuff than it is actual life experience. I think addiction is a survival function as a response to intergenerational transmission of the issues. It's interesting thinking about those types of experiences, which are beyond most people's ken. So that sort of disassociative state that he went into. the sort of physiological responses that he was getting. It would have been, you know, part of me, this is just the clinical bit of me, wants to sort of see what it's like now, as it were. And sort of,
I've wondered,
you know, what happened in terms of how, because that would have been, you know, that sort of decomposition that he went through. Would have been, you know, maybe the first time that had been witnessed, certainly not the first time it happened, and probably not the last time it happened, but maybe the first time it was witnessed in a sort of supportive environment, where he was given the opportunity to make some sense and meaning of that experience. And of course, always the way we make sense and meaning is that we connect with another human being.
Yes.
That's what's important. And that's what you offered, was that sort of human and humane connection. And also, I guess, that sense in which the house, the people that were in there, and them sort of being sort of given the signals, so it's all right, I might have been weird, it's all right. Just be normal to him.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? And that sort of normalization stuff, when somebody has those types of very strange sort of dissociative states, can be very helpful. I think. And I'm sure that if, you know, he went through the types of experiences in that book, which is described in that book, you know, lifelong issues dealing with it. There is also, I think, and this is my experience, I don't know about you, in my experience, there's a significant number of people who are in addiction who didn't have significant traumatic life experiences. And there's no particular reason why they would be an addict from that theory, which is why I think the notion of intergenerational transmission makes a lot more sense, because when you go through the family histories, then you begin to see.
Yes.
And I don't know if you've seen those things where you draw a diamond shape around 7 generations. You can find the originator of the trauma, and inside that diamond, you will find a whole bunch of mental health and addiction issues.
Yeah. I don't know that. I have read a lot of Bert Hellinger's work, and he works with constellations, which is the same, different way of doing it. But yes, and so sort of going back and looking through the generations and the more sort of wider and external, even sort of all of it. So the same sort of thing. I mean, and then you start to see it.
I think I share with you this sort of remarkable, this sort of awe and respect for the fact that humans can come through the extraordinarily difficult experiences and make it out the other side and transform. That transformation is always possible. And I suppose I would also think that there's a role these days for understanding what the technical professional stuff needs to be as well, in terms of making sure those types of environments are safe, because I think it's lucky you were a safe pair of hands. You might not have been.
No.
But it is lucky that emotionally you were there, and it sounds like that environment was it was a holding environment which contained, held. But you didn't end your sort of fascination with all of this stuff there. No, it wasn't like you then learned something from that and went, I don't know, I really want to go in that direction anymore. That didn't happen. That's not how the story goes.
No, I graduated to secondary school. Did it all over again.
Yeah, sort of. Tell us about
that. So I decided, I had a brief time with the local council where after I left rehab 5 years, and I only left because I was burnt out. I didn't leave because I wanted to leave. I was just tired. And I had a brief few months with the local council implementing the government's 10-year national drug strategy at local level. And
tremendously exciting.
I failed miserably at it. I wasn't really any good at what I did.
That you're actually very, very good at what you do. If you failed miserably at implementing a 10-year strategy,
I did.
Make you all right, actually.
I believe so. So it was a real tough call to go from an environment like that to working with drug treatment and testing orders like that's going to work. But my personal and professional relationship with addiction was that it's going to take a lot more than that. So I found I remember my mum saying, look, just do it for a couple of years and get some money behind you, because it was reasonably well paid, where working in treatment wasn't particularly. I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So I refinanced my house and I went traveling around the world, which was a lifelong dream really to do. And spent some time in Asia, India, and Malaysia, and where else? Thailand. And then eventually got to Australia and I only went to Australia because my boss in rehab had moved back by this time. This was some time later. So he had gone back there. So he said, you got to come to Australia. You got to come to Australia, Jack. So I did. And a few days after I got to Australia, I met my little boy's dad. And it was just this whirlwind nonsense, really.
Obviously, you hadn't learned about red flags at that point.
No. There are no red flags whilst you're on holiday or an extended. The red flags don't exist because nothing's real. You know, if you're on holiday, traveling around the world, nothing is real.
When you're love bombed by an addict, I mean, nothing could possibly be real, could it?
No.
I mean, who would want reality in the face of that?
No, if I'd have seen reality, it would have completely trashed my travel experience.
Got rid of the love bombing, it would have got rid of the fantasy. But anyway, it would have meant that you didn't have your son, which is...
Well, there we are. Again, meaning. And one or two other meanings I took from that too. So we had this sort of wild thing, really. I thought he was the one. He was Maori. He was extremely handsome. And that was it. We'd fallen for each other. And in those early days, don't get me wrong, you know, he was very attentive and on the phone, and you know, there was no game being played in the early days. There certainly was once I'd made the decision to live there. But in the early days, it was all good, and I ignored his capacity for alcohol quite successfully. When my travels ended, I came home, and
you had quite capacity for not seeing things.
I pride myself.
Just an observation. Sort of, have you worked on that? Have you got a qualification in it, or is it just?
Well, I've certainly got a life qualification in it, and yes, I have worked on it. I don't know if I have successfully overcome it, because there will never again be a time I can imagine where I would share my home or my life on that level with anybody. I'm not anti-men, far from it. But I can't imagine anybody being in my house again for any longer than a few hours at a time for a meal, or to take my son out for a bike ride, as a friend often does. So I'm not sure whether that is successfully recovered from it or not. Because personal relationships, I like it just me and Jacob now, and I'm much better at that. I'm much better at that. Yeah. So anyway, we had this whirlwind romance. We decided I would go back, and I did. And 6 months after I got there, and it all changed. It literally, this attentive. I mean, bearing in mind the time difference when I was here, when I came back after my travels, you know, it would ring 10, 11, 12 times a day, you know, and the time difference, that's no mean feat. So there was no sort of chase going on. It was a done deal. It was wonderful. And the day I got there, it was the day after. So I landed, he picked me up from the airport, all good. And the day after, he didn't come home. He went to the pub after work. So I'm literally less than 24 hours in the country. And I'm making dinner, thinking, I'm making dinner. You know, I'm doing my girlfriend thing. I'm going to have a lovely meal. We're going to have a lovely evening. Rah, rah, rah. He didn't come home. And when he did, he was wasted. Yeah. So the writing was on the wall. So 6 months, just under. I mean, progressively over the 6 months, I thought that okay, so the honeymoon is over. My travels are over. I wasn't quite sure whether it really was him that I had fallen madly in love with, or whether it was more about not really wanting the whole year-long adventure to end and go back to England and back to reality and getting a job and going back to all that. I don't know what influenced me the most, but you know, certainly after moving there, the veil came off, and I thought, oh, this is what am I doing on the other side of the world? I like England. I love my family. What on earth am I doing here? And just as I was sort of grappling and figuring that out, he drove me under a truck. And put me on a life support machine. So I wasn't going anywhere. So I was critical for a long time. I sort of life-sustaining or life-changing injuries, and that was me. That was me for the next 2.5, 3 years, not going anywhere whilst further recovery, surgeries. I had 17 altogether. Wasn't going anywhere. So, and I through that time, again, we got sort of back to meaning. I remember I had no personal history. I had no deep friendships over there, although I had one lady who I became extremely close to, and she was just an angel for me at that time. But no, you know, you realize when you're bereft of everything that holds you up, all the pillars in your life, your family, your work, your home, your community, your familiarity, when all of that has gone, it's quite an experience just to be left with you on your own, really. So I had to make sense of meaning. And I remember telling people, you know, when I would be out with my friend or this, no, I'm a survivor. I'm a survivor of a near fatal car accident, you know, and I would still have signs of, you know, sort of injuries and dressings and wounds and X-fixes and stuff all over me. And that's what I use to give myself some sort of significance, you know. Not that I'm Jacqui, I'm unemployed, I've not even got my visa sorted out here. In fact, that's a nightmare because I ended up in hospital. I've got nothing, and I'm in this relationship that is not healthy. I created myself as a survivor of this accident. And there was a time when I was going through that story again, and I felt a fraud, and I thought, that's run out, mate. That's run out. You're actually quite well now. And you have to, but I still hadn't finished with all the surgeries. There were still 2 or 3 more I had to go through. So that's when I decided, I've got to make meaning. I couldn't stagnate any longer, and I was sort of trapped a little bit. I could have come home, but I didn't want to risk being in the hands of surgeons that hadn't followed me all the way through, or indeed compromise the insurance payout. So, so I studied coaching. I signed up for coaching, and that was it ended up being longer than that, the whole thing. So that that sort of put some growth back in, really. And that's what I did. And then my partner, he got himself into a right fix and had a bit of a life-changing moment. And like with all sort of narcissists, I
was going to say, the part of me just got quite angry at the one. There wasn't one when he almost killed you and he smashed you to bits. Surely that's a life-changing moment. No, it happens quite some time. Anyway, that's just maybe me, my stuff, but you know.
I tell you what it has given me, Noel. If someone had have said to me prior to me going, this is what you're going to be in, this is what you're going to tolerate, this is what you're going to choose to not see, I would have laughed myself silly over it. And it gave me another level, really, of empathy. Whereas I work as well sometimes with public health and women who have gone through domestic violence and who have other complexities within them as well. So it gives, and indeed in private practice, I seem to attract women who are in damaging relationships and struggling to get out of them.
I wonder why, Jacqui.
I
know. Can't figure that one out at all. Not sure I know why. Answers on a postcard, send them in. If you can figure it out with Jacqui, let her know. That'd be great. I'm sorry, I'm teasing you.
No, you're quite right. It's comical. It's comical. But it has. I couldn't have worked with women like that before. I was an independent soul, lived on my own apart from Joe, the rest of my adult life. So most of my adult life lived on my own, done as I pleased, travelled, holidayed, festivaled.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have had and didn't have the humility to work with people in damaging relationships because I didn't understand it. So it did leave me with that. And I earned my stripes because I stayed far longer. But the true meaning of the relationship with an extremely cold and distant, cruel, emotionally cruel, it was never physically violent, but certainly very emotionally cruel, was Jacob, my little boy. But yes, I weathered it for all different kinds. I guess as well, there was a part I had begun again. I had taken a completely different direction when I went traveling. Then I began again when I got to Australia. Then I began again from an intensive care bed. And then the thought of, again, very similar to when I was with Joe, you know, you're so far in, somehow one way or another, this will work. And of course it didn't. But the thought of having to start again and again was overwhelming, really, sort of, and coming home to what, and an extremely wonderful, loving family. But the paradox was I was doing very well in my work. I loved it. I'd got a real community. I thrived in that. I learned to be self-employed. I would never have been self-employed before I went to Australia. So there was a real kind of parallel thing going on, sort of dealing with a very damaging relationship, and enjoying, I don't mean financial success per se, it wasn't that, just success. It was just a sort of enjoying work, doing work for myself, learning how to manage a business, run a business, all of that, and ending up being quite busy with that. So, and I didn't want to leave that. I didn't want to give that. I felt my journey with that I wasn't done, and I didn't want to come home and start again. And I wasn't quite ready to give up. I needed to really, really flog that relationship to the death. And I did. I had a mini breakdown one night in Australia, and I there's sort of trauma growth. Is it they call it? Yeah. And I'm a real big believer in that when people do finally melt down, whether it's for an evening or a week or whatever, that is the beginning of a growth of something. And and it was. There was one particular night, and I remember recovering from that night, and I remember thinking to myself, it was just clarity again. It was clarity. Now, that's not to say I didn't come home heartbroken and destroyed, and I lost everything again. My work, my business, my friends, my life, my pool, and are we allowed to swear?
Yes.
No. So my sister said,
Fuck yeah.
It's my fucking Ponzi champagne lifestyle, as my sister called it. I lost it. I lost it. I lost my pool in the sunshine, and I felt extraordinarily a huge sense of freedom in Australia, because I did. Certainly in the relationship, because he wasn't particularly interested in anything I did. So yes, that breakdown that night marked the change, really. And he bailed as soon as he discovered I was pregnant, which was shortly after that, a week or so after that. And I came home, 2 suitcases, 6 months pregnant at 46 and menopausal, and started again.
Ba-dum-dum. Right. Great story. I mean, amazing. I mean, I think that, there's many sort of lessons in there. The big one, I suppose, and why I was quite really excited about having you on the show. I mean, you're a great performer, so I don't have to do much. I just hand it over to you, let you get on with it. So it's been an easy evening for me in that sense. But also, people are going through shit at the moment, really, really tough stuff. And tonight, we have the new regulations coming in, and I can tell you that this pandemic is going to be around for 3 to 4 years. People don't want to hear that, but that's the truth. We're in wave 2, and waves go like this. That was the first one. This is the second one, and the third one will be like that. And the third one will come in March. That's the way it is. That's how they are. And then we've got 3 to 4 years of mess around this stuff. While we go from pandemic to endemic, and we're going to be having masks, and we're going to be having restrictions, and we're going to have better therapeutics, so fewer people die, but people are still going to die for years to come. But when you listen to Jacqui, it's all right. It'll be okay. I mean, it seriously will. We actually have that capacity as human beings, and you're a fantastic example of it. If people want to get hold of you, how do they do that? Have you got a website?
Everything's on the website, JacquiLane.com, JACQUI, JacquiLane.com.
We'll put a link to Jacqui.
Thank you.
You can get hold of her. And do you do any presentations and stuff like that? Any after dinner entertainments?
I do, although that seems
to say you must do with a story like that.
Well, at about after dinner, I've done. I do. It's all dried up. With
bear. We call her Jacqui, but she's going to entertain you.
Yeah, I do. That's my favourite place to work is in a training or a presentation, a room of people. But there's none of that going on at the moment. So, but you're right.
Jacqui's available. You want? It's make me think of that Maxell advert. You remember when tapes still existed?
Oh yes, yeah.
And the Maxell was a brand of tape, and they used to have that advert with a guy who would sit in a chair in a suit, and they put the tape on it, and then he'd just go.
I remember.
So that's it. What that experience? Just hire Jacqui, and that's.
I remember.
Do you remember it? Yeah. Same generation, aren't we? Anyway, it's been extraordinary to have you on, and I think there have been triggering subjects which have been dealt with in a very sensitive and humane and humorous way, but they are still serious and triggering. We've covered things that may have triggered people. If they have, there are organisations that exist, such as Samaritans, which will help you out. If you are in a situation where you're at risk because of domestic abuse, I would encourage you to seek help, get the police, get a hold of a refuge, get out of the threat immediately. Do not stay in it, even though we have dealt with it as a light-hearted issue, because that's how you heal at some point. It is very, very serious, and we know during the pandemic that the rates of domestic abuse have gone through the roof. So ask for help in those things. If you're struggling with addiction and you're recognizing this, if you're struggling with what Jacqui has or had, she's over it now, codependency, as we call it, there is help for that as well. Various places that you can go to, although we poo-pooed them, things like drug and alcohol teams exist in your local authorities, and so you can Google your local DAT services, and again we'll put these links out. There's other organisations such as peer support. Jacqui used the word peers a lot. Peer support organisations such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Codependence Anonymous, Al-Anon, etc. All of these are free, they're online, and you can get help for all of these things, all the subjects that you don't need to go to Australia and have somebody almost kill you to learn the lessons. You can do if you want, if that's what you want, if that's what floats your boat, but you don't have to. You can get help here and there. Jacqui, it's been amazing to have you on. Thank you so much. We have to finish there, I'm afraid. Remember what you were told before we started. Hold the pose for a few seconds.
Yes.
So I'm going to say good night to everybody. Wonderful to have you here. Really good to have the participation from everybody. We shall see you next week, and I can't remember who's on next week. I'm rubbish at my job, but there you go. Lovely to have you all. I'm going to say goodbye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.